Good day, good morning, or good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name is Skywalker Payne, and I am the founder of Vibrant Velvet Voice and the leader of the Facebook group you see here on the screen, Woman of Color, Tell Your Story. And today is my formal, official beginning of this YouTube series, Woman of Color, Tell Your Story. And it's going to be a varied and exciting series all around the woman of color. Because, as you can see, I am a Black woman who identifies as a woman of color, which does not mean that I am any less happy or proud or any way hesitant of calling myself a Black woman. In fact, I am, as I tell my husband almost every day, I am the Black Queen of the universe. But more than that, I am your woman of color collaborator. Which means particularly if you are a woman of color, I am here to collaborate with you, and in as many ways as we may find useful. You're collaborating with me by watching this YouTube video. And if you make a comment and I comment back to you, I've collaborated with you. And of course, there's more ways we can collaborate if you're an entrepreneur. I am always interested in collaborating and working with other women of color. And if you're a woman of color who's new to the internet or looking for other women of color, trying to find out the woman of color who is doing something online you're interested in, I can help you with that in many ways. I can tell you even what to Google or search for, and I can introduce you to some enterprising, experienced, exciting women of color entrepreneurs. But today, what I wanted to do was to look up and discuss and see what we can find on the internet about the woman of color. Specifically, I want to begin by looking at the origin of woman of color and see what we find. And as you can see in the group, the woman of color has two sides. There's as we all do, the negative side and the positive side. Okay, now we come to the results of our search. And here we've got women of color in Wikipedia. This is a good blog, which we're going to come back to, about in solidarity, how non-Black women of color stand upon the work of Black women. We'll get back to that. But there is, let's see what Wikipedia says, because I think they have the information. There is another YouTube video, which I can't post, and I don't want to because I'm giving you the information. But it's interesting too, and you may want to Google it on YouTube after this, or I might actually put it in my notes at the bottom. But let's go to Wikipedia and see what they say of the history and if they've got the history correct. And it's really weird when the camera quits working. Oh, I want you to keep sharing. And here I am again. Okay. Now, I'm not getting to the obvious. A woman of color, of course, is a woman of color. Now, what exactly of color does that mean? and what does it embrace? And this does not have the story, the information that I was looking for. In fact, this is a very bad, limited Wikipedia article. And I thought I could find an article, but I can tell you that the woman of color originated as a term during the 60s when Black women and other women of color were attending, many for the first time, I think, a Democratic convention for the presidency. And they had caucuses. And the caucuses, the Black women wanted to expand their caucus wisely to include other women of color who were experiencing some of the same and similar problems living in a country that puts people in boxes based on their skin color, their health, what they look like. But the boxes, women of color, whether you are dark-skinned Black American, light-skinned Black American, Muslim American, particularly Muslim and hijab, Native American, who act as if people act as if Native Americans, real Native Americans, don't exist anymore. Latina, Middle Eastern, and even if you are a white Latina who identifies as a woman of color, because, an Asian American, Pacific American, doesn't matter if you are not a white American female. Many people in the United States will put you in a certain type of a box. And we won't get into those stereotypes today because we know them all. And we are not here to perpetuate them. We are here to tell a new story of the woman of color. So what I was looking for, and I told you that actually, I've told you the woman of color originated as a political term. And it's remains that, but it's not being used wisely in politics, I think, until actually last year's election. Because we saw women of color, the woman of color ascend and participate in becoming a majority of women, the first, not majority of women in Congress, but more women in Congress than ever in history. And they did create a majority of the Democratic Party. But this is not an endorsement of one party or the other. That's another discussion. And we won't get into that today. In fact, no day. Politics is politics. Now, I may talk about people who promote compassion and fairness and justice. And of course, any woman of color who's involved in doing something outstanding. And we have several of those now, many of them in the United States Congress. And it's about time. So we found the definition of woman of color. Let's go back. And I've given you a listing of those who would be described as a woman of color. The reason I came up with the white Latina who identifies as a woman of color is because I read an article, a blog by such a woman. In fact, let's see if we can find her blog, a white Latina who identifies as a woman of color and see, you can see who she is. Of course, I'm not finding it now. Here it is. I am Latina. No, here we go. What it's like to be a white woman of color. And it's interesting because only in the Spanish speaking population in the United States can a person choose to be white or black. Now, if you're from the Middle East, you can be dark skinned, but you don't get to, and I think but they do have classes in terms of different people, but I don't know. I wonder if Middle Eastern people class themselves as white because they don't have a classification for brown people, which is interesting. Okay, this article was written by Daniela Ramirez, and it's what it's like to be a white woman of color. And it's a pretty old article. It was written in 2013, but she begins her article by saying, I'm white in race, but Latina in ethnicity. Growing up, I never really thought about this distinction. And then she goes on and talks about her experiences, many experiences that probably other Latinas have had, whether they were claiming to be white or black or brown. So today, I've introduced myself. I've introduced the series. I've given you a definition of woman of color. I've described who the woman of color is. Now I will talk about what is the purpose of these videos. The purpose of these videos is to make the woman of color appreciate herself and claim her position and influence in the world, and particularly online and in the internet. Because as we will go and see and look look at different postings and do different searches. When I started this research, which I really only began last year, towards the end of last year, I spent quite a bit of time trying to find the woman of color in different areas, in different topics. And sometimes I have to look and break down by different cultural or ethnic backgrounds to find Asian women of color in self-development, say, because they don't always show up on the women of color. And it's interesting how the Asian woman is sometimes considered a woman of color and sometimes not. But this is what is important for the woman of color to understand. You are not alone. You are part of the great world majority. Because when you step outside the United States and you look at China and Africa and India and South America, and the number of women of color, the woman of color, and I will say this often, is a seismic force for positive and compassionate action in the 21st century. And here we're going to share ideas, and also you'll be seeing in these series interviews with the woman of color online who has something to say, who has a story to tell. And it is our stories that need to be told now. The women of color who got elected to Congress had to tell their stories to get elected. But there are millions of stories that have not been heard, and they're still not being heard loud enough, often enough in every media. And that's what we have to do. This morning, and I have to share this. This morning, while I was doing my spiritual practice, and after my main spiritual practice, I take time to write. This year, I'm writing at least a page every day of a notebook I have. And this morning, this thought came to me. Why is it that all the major religions were started by men? Why is it that even in every religion, which has spiritually strong and knowledgeable women throughout their histories, do we know so few of them? Now, I am a practicing Buddhist, Tibetan Buddhist. And we're fortunate that we have Tara and Yeshe Soya. In fact, I came to Buddhism directly because of Yeshe Sogyal, who was a woman who wrote the biography of Padmasambhava, who brought Buddhism to Tibet. But as I read and study and practice, primarily are books by men, revelations, etc., etc. Now, I also was a Sufi, I also was a Catholic, and it's the same thing. And today, this rather strange thought came into my head that when you look at and consider religion as the highest spiritual, moral authority on the planet, and if men are the head of the religions, then it naturally flows that they should be the head of the society, the head of the government, the head of businesses, the head of the household. And my question is, how could this have always been? Because when we're dealing with spirituality, true spirituality, there is no sex, there is no body. So my question is, how did it come down that we've lived in this time and this mindset for over 2,000 years? Maybe even probably over 3,000 or 4,000 years when you think about what was happening historically before Buddhism, thinking about what happened with the Jewish people, think about traditions in Africa and Asia where men were always dominant. And there's something that's whispering in my ear that this has not always been this way. That, women are not naturally weak. In fact, to have a child requires a lot of strength. Now, I was never pregnant, but I worked as a labor and delivery nurse. And I know and I've seen the strength and endurance required to give childbirth. And let's not even get into what it takes to raise a child into adulthood, because unfortunately, we've had, from the state of the world we're in now, even there, women have had that power taken from them to be a positive influence in some cases, too many cases. But not only does the woman's mother's influence matter in bringing up a child, it's the society, and it's a person's karma, and it's a person's own intrinsic being, whoever they are. But get back to the original thought is, why and how did the woman of color lose her power? And I have this theory that women, being as strong as we are, able to endure what we can. At some point in some place, oh, many, many, many thousands of years ago, when women were in power on this planet, probably in some of these long ago sunken planets like Lemuria and Atlantis, that the women in power, just as too many people, power can lead to corruption. And the woman who is so strong and can endure so much probably did not take into considerations the feelings of the men who they had to deal with to have children to continue the population. But maybe the men were treated as little better than male bees are. Bees are. They were there for creating babies and then sent off like studs or something, not given the opportunities and the care or the participation that they wanted. And so over time, the man decided this isn't right and we're going to take over and you will never get ahead of us. I know that may be an utterly insane idea because there are few religions I know that women have started and are followed by men and women. But I'm going to do a lot more research on that because it's an intriguing idea. And the whole point of this YouTube series and of my podcast will be to increase the voice and spread and expand the vibrant velvet voice of the woman of color to share your wisdom, your knowledge, your expertise. So we have met, we have begun, and I'm not going to say I'll be here every week, but every week, definitely not every day. I'm going to try and make this be a weekly show at least and give you information and insight and inspiration, maybe a little entertainment and a little enlightenment. So until we meet again, have a wonderful time wherever you are in the world.